Welcome to Embroidered Bag Workshop Lesson 3. Today we're going to talk about applique, how to create them both out of wool and out of linen and silk. Right now I want to talk a little bit about how I come up with ways of making these appliques. I usually do some thought towards what I want to put on there, and most of my appliques are pretty big, so I try and find things that I can reproduce over and over, especially if it's for large S bags or whatever. Things that are pretty easy, have very few lines that I can then trace onto my heat and bond and have multiples of, so I can create a lot of them. But for my own work, sometimes I like things a little more complicated. Let's take this bag example. I actually took this off of a picture of a bag in a museum, overlaid it with my graphics editor, and then traced out all of the what I wanted to applique. And then once I got that traced out, I just put it into the heat and bond, which is this stuff. It comes in rolls. You need heat and bond light. Don't get anything any thicker. It's got the sticky part on one end, which is heat activated, and the paper on the other. And all you do is trace over the line drawing. Trace it all out and cut it out and iron it onto a piece of wool. So I've got a couple of pieces here that I've done. This is a dog. You can see there's the shiny bit before it's been ironed on. And basically I've just made that into a applique using this. It's pretty easy. I use this a lot for wool because it makes it really easy to deal with. You do have to worry about whether or not you're doing the right or the wrong side of something, because when you are doing the heat and bond and overlaying it, it will automatically mirror the image when you pull it off. If that makes any sense. So basically, if you're doing heraldic work, you have to make sure that you do everything's going to come out to the right side or the wrong side, depending on how you feel about it. If you can't see your design, I usually use like a pretty heavy Sharpie marker and just trace around all of the edges so that I can see them better. I'm just doing the outer edge. I'm not getting super excited about any of the details because I don't really need those right now. See, that's kind of where I've gotten with this. I don't really worry about the inside there. I just trace around, making sure that I get most of the contour line on, and making sure that I've got everything just one continuous line. Once I do that, I can actually see it a little bit better. This paper is pretty see-through. So once I've got that, I can then see it much better. I don't need a light table or anything like that. So then I trace it out on this paper, and this is how I make the same applique over and over and over again. I just use a template and trace around everything that I just drew around again. And I can make literally dozens of these appliques just off this one piece. And sometimes, you probably ask yourself, why would I need to make a dozen appliques of something? Well, if you're doing a dozen appliques of, say, Tudor roses, or a dozen appliques of Celtic knotwork, or what have you, for a dress or a coat, you're going to need to make the same thing over and over and over again. This just makes it easier to get the same thing time after time after time. So once I got it traced on there, I go ahead and I cut around it. I don't want to waste any fabric, so I give myself about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch around the design. And then once I got it out of the paper, I can find a piece of wool that I can iron it to. I clean it up a little bit because I like to make sure that I don't waste any scrap whatsoever. So I just sort of quickly trim around things, again giving myself about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch around it. So once that's done, I need to find myself a piece of wool to put it on. And I have a ton of scraps in the studio of all the things. Find a scrap that this will go on. This stuff is super sticky once it's heat activated, so I want to make sure that the scrap is big enough that I don't leave a bunch of residue all over my ironing board. So I find a scrap that I like, making sure that I don't have a lot of hangover. I think this one's probably a better one. This one's probably the bigger. Yeah, there we go. So that's a good one. That one will make sure that it all gets on there and I can iron it all on. So here we are at my ironing board. I've got my scrap, got my applique, I've got it fitted on so that I don't have it hanging over there and leaving anything off. And I have my iron, it's on the hottest setting, and it is no steam because steam will deactivate the sticky parts of the heat and bond. So hottest iron, no steam, and you just very nicely run it all over there to activate the sticky. The glue is quickly heat activated. And so now I'm ready to basically cut this out. So I'll cut this out following the lines. Once I've got it cut out, I want to iron it onto the bag face. So all I do, again, it's the hottest setting, no steam. I'm going to go ahead and just lightly iron this on, making sure that I'm not moving it around or pushing on it real hard or anything. Just letting this activate through. Now, the wool, depending on how thick it is, it's going to take a while for that heat to get underneath there and get that activated. So I just test it every once in a while and see if there's anything that wants to come up. And it looks like there's, some of it's still coming. So, just kind of keep going, keep activating it, keep getting that environment hot. And to sort of facilitate this, I also stop, flip it over, and then iron it from the back. This helps activate evenly the entire part of that glue. And I make sure that I get the whole thing on. You can kind of see where there's kind of a shadow of it from where I've ironed it on. I just want to make sure that it's all down and all ready to be stitched on. And that looks good. The way that you do a linen or silk applique is slightly different. I have the same design here, although this is not a great design for linen applique because it's got some really narrow areas. Well, I'll address those in a minute. I do the same thing, except just with a plain piece of paper. A light box would be really handy here, but I can kind of see it. And I go ahead and I trace it just like I did the last time with the heat and bond, but again, this is just a plain piece of paper. And make sure that I get all of the design on there. I could really use a light box, but I will soldier on. Just tracing everything around. I don't pay any attention to any of the interior stuff. This is especially true for linen or silk applique. In general, those really narrow areas are going to be hard to go around with the linen because I'm basically going to need a seam, and there's not a lot of fabric there to make a seam. So this is not the best design for this kind of applique, but I'll be able to show you some of the pitfalls as well as some of the tricks. So there I have it. I'm going to go ahead and cut this out along the lines with a pair of paper scissors. I'm not going to give myself a 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch on this because I want it to be exactly the same size as the design. Once I get it cut out, and I make sure that I sort of pay attention to all those pointed areas, I don't get super excited about them, but I do try and keep a lot of the contour. I cut the whole thing out. You can see I'm kind of following each and every little contour line. That is a little important because you want to preserve as much detail as possible in the applique for when you move on to embroidery. Again, these narrow areas are going to be a huge pain, so I try and open them up just a little bit more, so I give myself a little bit larger seam size. But as I said before, this is not the best design for applique. I probably would have moved the feet down a little to give myself some more room, but this particular design was never meant for linen or silk applique, but we can still use it. It's actually pretty educational to see how you have to deal with a lot of these points and a lot of these narrow areas. Being not super careful, but careful enough. So once I have this, I then move to a tacky glue. You can use Elmer's glue too, but I actually prefer this. It's kind of a fabric glue. It stays tacky pretty long. So what I want to do with this is I want to determine what side is right or wrong, and then I'm going to run a bead of glue along the edge of this piece of paper. I'm not going to try and glue the whole thing onto the fabric. I just want along the edge. And it's going to be about the same size when I'm done. And just glue along the edge with this nice glue that really doesn't want to come out. I've marked which side is the top, so the glue will go on and the fabric will go on. Here we go. Now, this is going to be super messy. This is going to get really messy really quick. But all I do is run just a bead of glue, a really nice, sort of very thin bead of glue along where I want to run it and where I'm going to be gluing it onto the fabric. I don't want to put glue on top of the entire thing, just along the edge. And that'll become apparent why I want to do that once I get this done. So basically I'm just putting bits of glue along the edge, making sure that I've gotten a nice bead. And again, this is going to get super messy after, just a few minutes. Oh my God, glue gets everywhere. But this is actually worth it. The other way that you can use linen and silk to applique is to not worry about turning the edges under and to put cord on the edges, and that's a period way of doing things. It's not quite as messy as this, but you also run the risk of having things fray. I much prefer this, even though it's got its issues. And once you get all this on, get all this glue where it needs to go, I'm going to lay this to the side and I am going to go clean up real quick because, oh, very messy. So I'm back. I've put the applique onto the paper and I've started turning the edges over. And what I mean by that is I've taken a little bitty pair of scissors and I have cut little snips into the fabric, not all the way to the paper, but just up to the paper. Snips into the corners and snips along the edges. I'm going to go ahead and run yet another bead of glue on there. And then I'm going to flip this over and give myself a seam edge. You can see where I've partially cut out the paper after putting that together on the top of the dog's back. I'm leaving the paper in place, but I'm cutting out as much of it as possible so that I've got the contour line thanks to the paper, but I have some base for the satin or the silk or the linen or whatever woven fabric you want to use. There's a base there that gives it some shape and gives it some stability. So I'm going to do this around the entire edge. I'm going to pay attention to my corners. Corners go over first, and then everything goes over the sides, so you keep a nice crisp corner. You follow the contours of like his feet here. You follow those around. Take your time. Move things over as they need. Make sure that you get all those nice round edges. And then once you're done with this, you can start pulling or start cutting out more of the paper. And that way, you won't have nearly as much paper, but you'll still have some nice applique that has some shape and keeps the contours of your original design. And this works for both linen, silk, cotton, any of those. Okay, so once you have either your linen or your wool applique, your next thing is to actually attach it to the bag face. This is a wool one, but this will also work for linen ones as well. You're going to want to stitch it all down because the heat and bond is not permanent. So you're going to want to stitch along the edges, like putting a patch on something. And usually I will either do a quick tacking stitch with hand thread, or I'll do a detached buttonhole stitch, which is kind of what I'm going to do right here. I also use pearl cotton, but mostly the sewing thread because eventually I'm going to embroider over this, so it's not going to really matter, and it's going to disappear into the pile of the wool. So here's a detached buttonhole stitch, where I'm just taking a bite of thread and putting it under a loop. I could also do a wrapping stitch, a whip stitch, what have you, anything that's going to put this down onto the bag face. That's your homework, by the way, for next lesson, is have this applique done and put on your bag face. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me at laurelyn@recreatedartifacts.com, and I'll see you next lesson.